Welcome, everyone, to Counterpoint Apologetics. And tonight we're going to be discussing a very topic on Burgos's book on Oneness Pentecostalism. This is a very pretty well known book. It's a book that probably covers some of the most well known Oneness Pentecostals and their views on the doctrine of oneness. So we wanted to do a video on each chapter, and tonight we're going to be covering chapters 1 and 2, and basically the reality of how Trinitarians want to present the oneness position and how we interact with that argument is very important. For the most part, when we look at the doctrines of oneness and Trinity, there can be some similarities and there can be some very major differences depending on which type of Trinitarian position you push. And tonight we're going to see in chapters 1 and 2 a very important distinction about how the arguments are presented. It's a very critical understanding to understand. So not to stop anything and get going with the video, I'll add my co-hosts tonight. And one of the primary things that we need to understand is that, just for a side note, we are not here to demean or minimize any type of argument against oneness position. We consider them critically and we evaluate them heavily. This is not going to be a just a free for all and acceptance for oneness is true. Doesn't matter what argument's there. It's just a fact, and we accept it. No, we critically evaluate oneness and Trinitarian arguments. I don't care who you are. This is extremely important. So, I wanted to welcome everyone to Tim and Brother Brandon Nero.
Hey, good evening, everybody.
One of the things I definitely wanted to do is you guys go through your view on Burgos's book, just as a general overall, and give you your thoughts on it, because I think it's a very good book from a position of treating the sources, going as many sources possible. I think that's a very important thing. Obviously, he definitely does a very good job of getting probably as many sources as possible. So Tim, if you want to start, follow the cloud.
Yeah. So I actually, compared to the other books I've read against Oneness Pentecostalism, I do have to give credit to Burgos' work as probably the one that interacts with us the most, that is actually trying to deal with our scholarship, whereas the other ones, that they seem like they'll take one of the more popularized books from Bernard and sometimes not even mischaracterize him really. So I really do appreciate the rigorous attempt to actually interact with us. Obviously, I still differ with him on his actual viewpoints, and I think where his book starts to fall apart a little bit is when he himself is trying to define what he thinks the Trinity is, and I think we can get into that more, especially in today when he started tonight per se, when he's actually getting into his defined terms.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I would echo a lot with that's been said already. And I think what Dr. Burgos is doing within his book, he is trying to create a holistic approach to articulate the main points of contention that we have between, Trinitarians and oneness believers. And he starts, with definitions, framing the differences within the position. And interestingly enough, he starts the conversation off by trying to root, I guess, what we would consider modern day oneness Pentecostals within the Christological tradition of early modalists. And so you see him kind of beginning this off by hedging it. But just to reiterate what's been said, I think he does a very energetic attempt to interact with our scholars and probably what would be the hand references of those who would want to try to increase their ability to defend the oneness position. And for that, I'm very appreciative.
Absolutely. I mean, we always want to be fair and honest, no matter whose argument it is. We have absolutely no problem in engaging with Unitarians, Trinitarians, social Trinitarians, Muslims, whoever it is. But the key is one of the things I always find interesting is, and it's whether it's on TikTok or anywhere else, for the most part, we will articulate the Trinitarian position and steel man it as much as possible. But when it comes to a oneness position, I don't feel that actually happens a lot. They just come in with skin suit arguments and they really don't actually engage with the actual position. I think Burgos doesn't. There's some of that in his book, but it's not as bad. So I give him credit for that. And but some of the things it does tend to go toward the skin suit arguments. I'm not going to say he doesn't. I just don't think. And to be honest with you, that may be because of some of the people that he's using in his for his information. Right, he does cover a lot of authors, so it may be selective. I don't know his intent and how he did the book, but obviously, just like Trinitarianism, there's some variations in our view of the incarnation. So that's kind of where that would come in at. So overall, we're going to get into a lot of his inconsistencies and also oneness inconsistency as well. I'm an equal opportunity person. I don't care about your argument. I just care about what is a good substantial argument. Good, bad, and different. We're going to look at it and see what it is and where it stands on both sides of the spectrum. And I know these gentlemen here are very much into that area as well. We don't. We try to be as least biased as possible, as we can be, good or bad. So, where would y'all like to start anywhere specific? Because tonight we're going to cover chapters 1 and 2. Did y'all want to start anywhere specific?
Yeah, we can start at the beginning. I think what I found really kind of off-putting in the beginning was his praise of Dalcour's book, because given how he tried to deal with this, I'm surprised that he would think that that's one of the best up to date, or maybe he's just saying it's the best until his book, because the way that Dalcour treated us was with such dishonesty. And so for someone, and I don't take Burgos's book as trying to be the same level of dishonesty. So I'm just amazed that someone who could write a book like this would give much praise at all to anything of Dalcour's.
Yeah, I would agree. I think he's very much building off the momentum that Dalcour, which I think Dalcour does a somewhat par level of a job that you see like with Boyd. Even though Boyd, I think, tries to cover so much of oneness theology, he really doesn't zero in on Christology proper the entire time. Mm-hmm. But I think one thing that he does in the beginning of the book, which is helpful, he defines what he believes the Trinity to be, which I would say, as far as dealing with a work that is going to really refute the oneness view, I really would want it. It's a very generic definition of the Trinity, which I think to really be specific, you're really going to have to get down to, because, just saying the standard Orthodox, Trinitarian view, there are Orthodox Trinitarian views, quote unquote, that he really doesn't kind of makes it very clear where he's coming from. Is he East? Is he West? Because I think understanding those particulars are really going to kind of help us to see, like, wait a minute, are you really making an argument against us? Or are you making an argument against others who would affirm your view? And that's why I think that probably his definition of the Trinity would kind of, because he doesn't outright, I would say, articulate the clearest view. Like when I'm talking to an Eastern Orthodox, I know when I'm talking to an Eastern Orthodox Trinitarian. If I'm talking to a Coptic, one holding me a Physitism, it doesn't take very long. This is very middle of the road Southern Baptist kind of definition of the Trinity.
Absolutely.
And I think, to kind of piggyback off of that, Brad Nero, I think when he was trying to define the Trinity, he was trying to keep it as basic as he can, where all the Trinitarians agree on. And I appreciate that, but the problem is it's vague. And where that middle of the road vagueness kind of falls apart as when he starts trying to define person. I'm not even so sure. Maybe being would be more typical, but when he was defining person, that's where you start seeing clear indications of where he lies. And it seems, not saying that he would say that he's this, but it sure sounds and rings of social Trinitarianism.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. Is there any pages that y'all want to go to specifically? I have a digital copy that we can run through for make sure people see the text. Don't want anyone to.
Well, I
Yeah,
think.
yeah.
Oh, you go ahead.
No, you go ahead. Go ahead first.
Well, I was just looking at page 11. I have the digital and I have my hard copy that I had spiral bound in preparation for the debate because I'm a little bit extra. But looking at under the section of under the Trinity defined, if one, in course, he says if one were to believe that Trinitarianism is a monolith, one might expect to see a variance in semantics regarding the doctrine, but not in substance. Many Trinitarians express ideal sentiments of doctrine by means of wide array of terminology. However, it is erroneous to suppose that Trinitarians are a monolithic group in a certain sense. There are many who might claim the moniker while deviating from the historic and biblical understanding of the doctrine, and that's interesting because he's putting himself within the line of historic continuation of the original framers from Nicaea on. With regard to these people, the appellation Trinitarian is a misnomer. There are, however, 3 biblical truths that all Trinitarians must believe by definition. Now, this is interesting. He's making it clear that some of them they're not real Trinitarians per se, but there is that all Trinitarians have to believe this. It's like that's the first part of it to me. It's kind of like, well, all of them are not real Trinitarians, and of course I'm paraphrasing it, but they all have to believe this. And to me, especially when you get down to these are the however 3 biblical truths that all Trinitarians must believe by definition. These are there exists only one true God. The Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are ontologically God and therefore co-equal. The Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are eternally distinct persons. And maybe I overlooked it, but did you gentlemen see anything about processions or anything like that? Because if you're going to make a claim of historicity, you need to be able to link us to a creed. We need something, or you Chalcedon. Like it leaves it right. Only requirement is to believe in multiple persons.
Yeah, and that's extremely vague. And when you try to present it like that, I agree. It's very top superficial level. There's not a lot of depth. Of course, he gets into persons, obviously, and that's a problem. But yeah, I would agree with your points on that, Tim.
Right. No, and that's what's so interesting about this is that it's actually so vague that, of course, we understand that every Trinitarian has to accept those 3 components, right? But that's where the agreement ends. Right here, he just laid down the basic agreement, and it's funny to me because it is not a long section by no means. It's like maybe it's a couple pages, and it's not because the agreement ends very quickly as far as the different models of the Trinity. And when we start getting into his specific model, like I said, you have to go down to his understanding of persons. That's when we start actually understanding where he lies within the spectrum of Trinitarian ideology. So, yeah. I think the kind of also play off this, and this is kind of this idea of divine revelation that he has, right? He holds very closely to progressive revelation. This is a couple pages before. And what I find really interesting is the conflation between when God reveals himself is more so revealing who he is in terms of his character, in terms of his relation to his creation. But and I've seen this with a lot of Trinitarians lately, is they conflate that with this progressive revelation providing more of a new revelation of God's being, of how God's divine ontological makeup is consisted of. If I could say it in such a way. And I find that really interesting that that's his understanding. Like he actually lays out progressive revelation and everything leads to this idea of God's relationship towards creation, but then somehow they kind of throw in the monkey wrench and just like randomly put in there, okay, so now we can see how later on we could see that the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, and through progressive revelation, has actually always been a biblical concept. It just wasn't quite known in the Old Testament.
Which is much more of a view I think James White would push
Right.
than a lot of them, like Albie. Albie Al would make an argument like, "Oh, they just knew it, and they just expected everyone. They didn't really cover it in the New Testament because everyone just understood it," and which
Right.
is an extremely odd way to minimize the problems with the Trinitarian doctrine not being fully explained at all. Because it's not just. I would say it's just the problem with the Trinitarian doctrine is they have what you would call a predicate distribution fallacy among Trinitarians. They just assume because the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are all God. Well, when the Scripture strictly speaks of the Father in certain ways, well, there's nothing that's said about that way toward the Son or the Holy Spirit. Well, just because they're God, well, I can just predicate these things to them. That's not how it is. And the reason why they do that is because if sonship is an incarnational value, then you have a problem. You can't predicate those things to the divine aspect, right? The divine person. So that's where they have to make everything about eternal existence versus just simply incarnation. And that's why when you start getting to why does the Father seek such to worship him? Why does the Son strictly pray to the Father? Why isn't, if there's true relational values of the man toward his God, as all men should, why isn't he praying to the Holy Spirit? Why isn't he praying to the eternal Son? If a human nature is existing and which has a true relationship to God, how do you do that? You have to have the true, otherwise then I don't have to pray. If Jesus doesn't have to pray to the eternal Son, why do I have to? He has to carry the same values and relations to his God as we do. And if that's not true, then you're missing something there. That's the whole point of the incarnation. And that's also another failure where you get into the filioque arguments of Trinitarians. They take something that's of the incarnation and exaltation of Christ and the mediation of the kingdom by the Spirit, and they apply that to the divine ontology, and boom, what do you have? You have a argument between East and West for centuries. Well, that's not an eternal value. That's a incarnational exaltation value and economy aspect. So,
and I think that you actually hit on something, because that was this is why I think on page 12 he actually hits he does and again I understand it's a book dealing with oneness, but I guess as it relates to defining the Trinity, the definition he gives of perichoresis there, which is really more of nature-based perichoresis. Person-based perichoresis, not nature-based, which Oliver D. Crisp wrote a great book on it. I think around page 20 or so, he details the distinctions, which nature-based would be earlier. But as it relates to the issue of processions, spiration, and generation, he doesn't touch that at all, which I would say that's absolutely essential to understand the historic doctrine of the Trinity, because if we assume a Western understanding of this, where there are two principles in the divine essence, well, we just need to start right there, because we potentially have polytheism. But the main things that really divide Trinitarians, I notice they're not addressed, they're not touched. And he actually says something interesting. He says that indeed the only means to differentiate the divine persons is the manner in which the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit relate to each other and to creation, which my understanding of inseparable operations, you really can't bring a distinction of persons external the divine essence. The only way to bring a distinction or to have a consistent distinction of persons is intra the essence, and that's by origin. So I was very shocked to kind of read that. I'm like, wait a minute, that's not historic orthodoxy. You have to, because you really can't tell if it's an action outside of the essence. And I was kind of shocked by that, which even in the way of granting, okay, you can discern the persons by how they relate, which is historic Trinitarianism, but he didn't give the way that you discern the relations, which it has to be generation, which my suspicion is if you open that up, you will not be unable to deal with the subject of do all three persons have aseity, or is it just the Father? Which the Father having aseity is the historic view, which is why many early thinkers would think many of the early proto-Trinitarians like Martyr and such were subordinationists.
Yeah, and before we move on to that next page, I also want to know, isn't it? You guys think it's interesting where he talks about the what one means by separate persons? Because in one sense, he would say it's a straw man of Trinitarian ideology. And from a classical standpoint, he would be correct. It is a straw man to say that Trinitarians believe in separate persons. But then he also says if you mean separate persons in terms of just that they're not each other, then you're right. But if you're trying to create a tritheistic implications out of it, then you just don't, you got it wrong. But I think in his book, and I wonder if he would take this advice, it may be best just to reject it altogether, because you leave room for a disconnect. Because either in one sense you believe it's separate persons, or you don't believe it at all. Like why is he trying to play both sides here in that particular saying? What are your thoughts on that? Because that to me was a little bit like
obviously he's
unique
playing the
statement.
term separate versus distinct, right? Distinct, separate, depends on how you use the word. Trinitarians lose their mind if you say they're separate persons, and where they say no, there's a relation there, and it's metaphysical values and all that. So he's probably pulling the strict card on separate versus distinct. But yeah, the reality is when you have, if you go to three minds and three wills, you there's nothing but separate. There's no way around it. It's just like if you get into the psychological model of the Trinity, it is intellectual partialism, because if the Father is the knower and the Son is the known, and the Spirit is the will or the love of the binding of the two, then you have individual intellectual partialism of the persons. Now you actually had to finally have grounding, and therefore the Son and the Spirit aren't brute in what the reality is, like an Eastern Orthodox would more be prone to, but at least they have some type of grounding. But Burgos doesn't seem to go with a psychological model of the Trinity here. He's just very social Trinitarian, and I know he'll probably balk at that. But anyone that ever knows me says the proof is in the argument. If your arguments scream distinct minds and wills, you're a social Trinitarian. I don't care about your claim. I don't care about how close to orthodoxy you make statements about. I don't care if you agree with perichoresis, mutual indwelling, and all these other doctrines. Don't care. If your argument pushes three minds and three wills, you're a social Trinitarian. You can't play one side and then the other side go, oh, no, I believe this. That's not how it works. Now, obviously, the incarnation is a distinct aspect, right? Most things that Trinitarians do, this is number one rule. When you argue with a Trinitarian about their doctrine, or they argue with yours about your view of the incarnation, what do we see? We see the very most principal thing is they argue Jesus and the Father going back and forth, prayer, submission, will, whatever. Okay, that's incarnational. That's ad extra. That's God in creation and redemption. That's not divine ontology acting toward one another. Why? Because Jesus is a composite of existence. He has divine and human natures in a classical view. Therefore, there is a distinction. It's not two divine ontologies speaking to each other, right? Obviously, they predicate it all to the eternal person, but they say, well, it's via the natures. So Burgos does this too. He pushes everything to validate the Trinity in the incarnational values versus actually prove it in divine ontology. Specifically, they just have to push everything to the divine. John 10:30, where I and my Father are one. Well, that's about divine ontology. Forget about incarnation. It's about divine ontology. Oh, well, it involves incarnation too. What, so
you actually hit on something I was Well, an observation I made earlier, also looking at some of his further articulation of what person is, or how to understand the distinction. He goes on to say, and I think this is right before footnote 35 on page 14. This conclusion is verified by manifold biblical data, which depicts God as exercising all of the above hallmarks of personhood. God is relational, logical, the supreme moral judge, is creative, and thus engages in abstract thought, which is interesting and is utterly self-aware. All of these attributes boil down to the ability to engage in love. And we will find in the biblical text is a father who loved his beloved before the creation of all things, and out of the eternal love gave the son his spirit. God is love, and therefore God is person. He doesn't quite use the Saint Victor argument of love, but a lot of the language there very much resonant of social Trinitarianism, especially as earlier Trinitarian theorists historically did not speculate on the inner life of the Trinity. Their way of bringing the distinction is by points of origin, or the lack thereof in the case of the Father, which anytime I hear a Trinitarian use that, it always makes my ears go up, because I'm like, now you may be saying orthodox, but I'm not really sure if that's really what your arguments are going to reflect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I that's spot on for Nero. It's just very interesting the way he's using it. And I think I don't know if you have your PowerPoints, Chris, but maybe bring up some of the quotes by Praxius, because it's really interesting how he cites Praxius here when he's talking about keep going with the rational subject aspect.
Yeah, he quotes Tertullian in against Praxis, and I'm kind of maybe someone he can do an explanation on it. Let me add this slide in here. Not sure if it's updating. I'm switching screens. All right. Well, one of the things I noticed is he in his statement he said he quoted Praxis, but when we go to, for example, this one? No, here it is. We go to this. This is J.N.D. Kelly, his early Christian doctrines. And when he's talking about the word persona being used, he says the primary sense of persona was mask, from which the transition was easy to the actor who wore it and the character he played. In legal usage, it could stand for the holder of the title to a property, but as employed by Tertullian, it connotated the concrete presentation of an individual as such. In neither case, it should be noted, was the idea of self-consciousness nowadays associated with person and personal at all prominent. So, I mean, here's J.N.D. Kelly basically refuting that mindset about self-consciousness and individuality of the mind and all this. That's not, if anything, the mask then would be one person being perceived as X in different, multiple ways. So that's definitely problematic to me from a historical standpoint. And when we went to just to go to another this one up. So when we go down to the quote actually by um, Tertullian, it's problematic to me. I'm not, like I said, I'm not really sure where he's getting it, but it says in you can go on to New Advent Advent and find this. This is where I got it from. But in chapter 5 it says, but since they will have two but be one, so that the Father shall be deemed to be the same as the Son, it is only right that the whole question respecting the Son should be examined as to whether he exists or who he is and the mode of his existence. Thus shall the truth itself secure its own sanction from the Scriptures and the interpretations which guard them. There are some who allege that even the Genesis opens thus in Hebrew. In the beginning, God made for himself a son. Now, notice that's clearly not the norm. In classical Trinitarianism, the son is not made, or it's not an action of will. So we already have problems. Made for himself a son, as there is no grounds for this. I'm led to other arguments derived from God's own dispensation, in which he existed before the creation of the world up to the generation of the Son. For before all things, God was alone, being in himself and for himself, universe and space and all things. Moreover, he was alone because there was nothing external to him but himself. Yet even for not then was he alone, for he had with him that which he possessed in himself. That is to say, his own reason. For God is rational, and reason was first in him. And so all things were from himself. This reason is his own thought or consciousness, which the Greeks call logos, by which the term we all designate word or discourse. And therefore it is now usual with our people, owing to the mere simple interpretation of the term, to say the word was in the beginning with God, although it would be more suitable to regard reason as the more ancient, because God had not word from the beginning, but he had reason, even from, before the beginning, because also word itself consists of reason, which it thus proves to have been prior existence, as being its own substance. Not that this distinction is any practical moment, for although God had not yet sent out his word, he still within him had him within himself, both in company with and included within his very reason, as he silently planned and arranged within himself everything which he was afterwards about to utter through his word. Now, does that sound like some classical Trinitarianism?
Well,
Not in the least bit.
Yeah, and the thing about this, right? If anything, this kind of goes against what Burgos is trying to lay out in his book, because Burgos is trying to lay out how there's three distinct persons, and then he defines persons as like this idea of having its own rationale and stuff. And I see why he's doing this, because he does talk about God having his own conscience, his own, how he's a rational creator, rational being. But this logos, this rationale that is supposed to be predicated to what we now know in Trinitarian thought as the eternal Son or the eternal Word, it is not its own conscience. It is not something, if anything, from this point of view, from Tertullian, according to the book that Burgos is laying out here, he would have to admit that the Son, and this is in Burgos' terms, right? The Son and the Father are one person. In Burgos' definition, I'm not saying in Trinitarian definition of persona, but when Burgos tries to lay out what he thinks Tertullian is getting at, he would have to concede that Tertullian views God's rationale, and God's as Father, or God as God, as being one person, one conscience.
And I think that really hits, especially when reading Tertullian. I always say chapter 5 is probably one of the most devastating chapters against Praxis, which I think Praxis was more of a pseudonym against the Bishop of Rome at that time. What you pick up from Tertullian, in a lot of his argumentation, he starts off with assumptions, and he doesn't always defend them as if this should be commonly understood. And a lot of that comes from Tertullian's Stoic influence, because from his rationale, this should be common sense. But especially when he gives these examples of as a person has thought within themselves and the thought is generated out. I think Tertullian is trying to counter the fact, okay, he knows that he can't try to put the sun in Genesis 1. So he has to still maintain absolute oneness of God in the sense that his detractors wouldn't refute, but still he has to get to point B where they are distinct persons. And I think what Tertullian is expressing, of course, is the earlier form of logos theory, which is a two-stage type approach to it, which got the wisdom cognitively indwelling. Then you have the logos express, which in Tertullian's viewpoint, because he is a true Stoic, this is why I think he tries to weaponize this to be an argument for persons. But I always say Tertullian is very problematic to use as argumentations for Trinitarianism, especially considering how he ended with the Montanists.
Right. And it does seem from this concept of what Tertullian's bringing out in this chapter, it doesn't sound like he believes in eternal Son. It sounds like even those who do, and they even try to interpret Genesis 1 in such a way that he doesn't think there's any standing with that. There's no really no good reason to really back that up. Instead, he believes it sounds like more of a eternal reason.
Yeah, and it's also reasoning is willing. Ultimately, it's derived from the Father's willing, right? So that's problematic because when we start getting into these type of arguments, and this kind of leads to a more of a psychological trinity if it went anywhere, right? Psychological model. The problem is that when you start looking at a psychological model of the Trinity and how it comes down to intellectual partialism and a whole bunch of other problems with it, that's not how people argue the Trinity, though, against us. They argue distinct minds and distinct wills and all this. But when you go to this actual model of God ad intra within God, this doesn't even make sense to even argue ad extra in redemption and creation. Because no matter the model, if you're a true classical Trinitarian, you believe in one mind, one will, one thought, action, essence, nature, substance, blah, blah, blah. And the Father is the source of all thought, will, and action. Well, the Son and the Spirit are logical byproducts ultimately of the Father. If the Father is a source, and Scripture is completely always about the Father, it's the Father's foreknowledge. It's the Father's willing this. Ephesians 1 is complete on this argument, on this, how that works.
Right.
Well, the problem is that you can't argue that the way Trinitarians, unless you're a social Trinitarian. And what do we see? It's not just his words about what persons are at the beginning. His ultimate, when we go through the other aspects of his book in different parts of the series, his arguments tell you he's social Trinitarian. There's no way around it. You can argue persons over here, even if he argued it correctly, right, and said subsisting relations and all this. But then he goes over here and argues three minds and three wills. What does it matter what the term person is over here? Because that's the huge dividing line. What is person? What does it mean? How does that work out economically, relationally toward another? Because you can put any type of definitions to person, but there has to come economic values of relation by which they exist toward each other, right? That's social or classical. One's a unit of a whole, part of a whole, and the other one's individual aspects where they have their own rationale, their own thought, their own will. They don't have the nature. They have the nature. They are not the nature, right? So they have individuality of nature. Because if nature is part of will, then they have, having the nature, and it's not going to work out like classical and Trinitarians work goes. So it's problematic.
Yeah, right.
And you hit on the, I think what they call the psychological model of the Trinity, which some have argued is really just modalism, because the only real distinction is conceptual distinctions. memory, foreknowledge, and cognition. And I was talking to one friend. I said, if that was all your distinctions were, I said, we may not even have a fight. And he said, well, no, there's my, I said, then that's where we diverge. I said, if it's more than conceptual distinction, if that was it is what you meant, I said, we probably could maybe to some degree say it's just semantics. But I think Augustine said, God is three what I know not, something to that extent. I'm sure I'm butchering the quote, but I think the earlier framers who were, even though I disagree with them in a lot of ways, I think they stayed away from a lot of these issues because they understood trying to really hone the distinction in would lead to these wonderful opportunities to be countered, no pun intended with the theme on it. I think they foresaw this prophetically, that if you push these distinctions too much, you're going to lead yourself open to accusations of tritheism.
Right. And again, and I think we can kind of sum up this section in showing the flaw in Burgos's point here is that where he uses Tertullian to kind of set up his understanding of person as something with a rationale and trying to use that to show a distinguishment between the Father, Son, and Spirit as three co-equal, co-eternal persons, is if you look at the source that we just brought up, again, where Burgos tries to use that to show distinctions of rationale, Tertullian is saying that the Logos, or the logic of God, the reason of God, is the rationale of the Father, is the rationale of the source. And when you look at it that way, or when you look at this, the source that he's citing right here, it really is kind of devastating to the point that he is making when it comes to persons defined. I don't know if there's anything else that y'all want to add to continue this section, but I think from here we kind of exploited enough of the issues with his section on how he defines person.
Yeah, there's definitely a couple things I wanted to go over on this. Let me bring this up. But I would say one of the biggest things that he has problems with, and ultimately, and this is kind of where he goes into perichoresis later and some other facets. What happens is he blends things, and this is a common Trinitarian tactic. Maybe, and to be honest, I don't even know if they even understand that they are switching back and forth. I'm going to be honest with you. I don't even know if they even recognize it, right? When you look at when he says, for example, here, person equals mental faculty and has volition in his statement, right? Well, the problem is if you read here, if person includes a volition as a defining marker, then three persons naturally reads as three volitional centers, three wills, three minds. There's not much you're going to be able to do about that. Unless Burgos explicitly denies this definition drifts toward social Trinitarianism. Right? There's no way around it. On the next one, person equals a subsisting relation, not a psychological subject. In Matthew Barrett's book, and I highly recommend Trinitarians read a classical book on Trinitarianism, Barrett says a person is a subsisting relation distinguished from another person by his eternal relations of origin alone: paternity, filiation, inspiration. This is essential because that is the only distinction. He also says in Simply Trinity, relations referring not to relationships, which is a modern psychological category. Notice you have to be very careful about that. They'll say relation, but these Trinitarians that don't know any better, they'll say, oh, they have relationships. Not quite the same thing. I understand the error, why it happens, but you have to pay attention to those kind of things. But to each person, everlasting provenance. Some even combine the two, calling the persons subsisting relations. Still others said paternity, filiation, inspiration are properties unique to each person. Persons are identical in all things except these personal properties. The only personal properties that you can identify, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, are paternity, filiation, and inspiration. That's it. If you look at God, you're not going to know him by the difference of substance, essence, all those things. It's the eternal relations origin, how the Father, the begetting of the Son, the spirating of the Spirit. Right. Errors in Nicaea and its legacy says one does not find in pro-Nicenes extended attempts to develop an ontology of divine personhood, which is kind of devastating, really. One will in God, not three. And this is one of the other things that Barrett brings up because he has volition. Because if each person has volition, and notice, let's say Burgos he just made a mistake. Maybe we're misunderstanding him. Okay, great. Our fault, whatever. Maybe we're just, we're in the weeds a little bit here and we're trying to be a little too technical. But the problem is, his arguments don't say that. That's the problem. I could say, okay, great. There's a mistake here. We're overcritical. Great. But on the other hand, then why are you arguing like this? Like James White does, right? Philippians 2. Considered him not something to be grasped, but to be equal with God. How do you have consideration of an eternal Son when there's one mind and one will? How does he have a distinct rationale to do such a thing?
Let this mind be in you.
Exactly. I mean, there's so many problems that they just don't think about it because they just don't.
They're so focused on showing polypersonalism at every opportunity that they neglect the infrastructure of their metaphysics at the expense of showing distinction into the essence of God, which I think if it's a sword you want to die on, it's definitely not the one on compromising true monotheism or one mind, one will. But many arguments, many times will jettison that position to go for the perceived opportunity to show a distinction into the nature of God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And they think because they say one God, some type of corporate entity, as long as we say one and then have sub layers of existence, well, we're not polytheists. We're not tritheists. No, that's not how it works. If you have literal own actions that are self-derived, that's polytheism. You can talk about same substance all you want to or whatever. They're acting independently, and that's where you get into the problem of infinite perfection. If infinite perfection is of one perfect will, how can you have multiple wills in perfection? That's a major problem. But with classical Trinitarians, guess what? They don't have that problem necessarily. Even if if they have the psychological model, they won't have that problem because it's literally the aspects of the intellectual procession, right? If it's an intellectual procession, it's an activity toward one goal. Well, they don't have a problem with that in that sense. So that argument would not bother them. Social Trinitarians, it's devastating. How can you have perfection multiplied and have distinction in the perfection? It's absurd as an absurdity. But just go to real quick here on this. The Father and Son in Spirit, says John Owen, this is according to Matthew Barrett, have not distinct wills. They are one God, and God's will is one as being an essential property of his nature. Barrett also says, for where there are three wills, there are three separate centers of consciousness. And where there are three separate centers of consciousness, there are three separate gods. So that's not me. That's Matthew Barrett. And I mean, there's tons of this because that's one of the big arguments in Trinitarianism now is this is not historical Trinitarianism if you're a social Trinitarian. These books are about classical Trinitarianism, one mind, one will. Father's the source of all thought, will, action. And the resulting reality of perfection comes by means of Son or Word and Spirit. That's very problematic. And hopefully, Burgos reads Matthew Barrett's book on Simply Trinity and understands that social Trinitarianism isn't the source of necessarily the political aspects that he thought. The source of social Trinitarianism is the concept of God, and the byproduct of that brought about political implications that people tried to use. But social Trinitarianism is a view of God in of itself. So that's literally why we have books on social Trinitarianism, and they don't bring up politics and how society exists. But they use that for that, though. I would agree. Which Matthew brings up very clearly in his book, Simply Trinity. And I also recommend you Nicaea and Its Legacy by Ayers. It's an excellent book on classical Trinitarianism. One other thing, if there's a book called it's philosophical and theological essays, and McCall and Ray say the central commitment of social Trinitarianism is that God, there are three distinct centers of self-consciousness, each with its proper intellect and will. The central commitment of anti-social Trinitarianism is that there is only one God whose unicity of intellect will is not compromised by the diversity of persons. So the application of Burgos is Burgos defines personhood with volition and self-awareness and emotive expression. That is functionally the social Trinitarian commitment, distinct centers of self-conscious, each with its proper intellect and will. If Burgos denies this, his personal definition must be rewritten. And I would have to agree with that.
I think that's why the beginning definition of how Trinity is defined, the main emphasis is to show distinction of persons. It's not really defining what I would say a very clear articulation of the Trinity is, in my view.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I would agree. Remove that. I was going to bring up Burgos's book real quick.
Because one aspect I really would be interested to see how it develop is especially when we get into the part dealing with monotheism. I think there's a lot to be discussed there.
Yeah, definitely. The one part I wanted to read on his book, I think it starts right here. Tertullian, who introduced the term person into theological discourse, interpret person to refer to a rational subject, whether creature or creator, i.e., artificer, who speaks and responds to speech in a reasonable manner. So, among physical creatures, these qualities have been communicated as a result of the Imago Dei. The image of the God is the most significant delineating factor which distinguishes man from his fellow physical creatures. It endows him with confluence of qualities that is specific only to persons, namely a mental faculty which possesses volition and logic. So I don't see how he gets around that. I mean, it's right there. How do you get around each person having distinct centers of consciousness? Because you cannot have that without will, mental faculty, volition, logic. I mean, there's just no way around it.
Anytime you see it, I usually try to exercise a lot of grace when talking to some Trinitarian. But when I always was talking to an Eastern Orthodox friend. I said, I will be honest. Whenever I see multiple wills or consciousness, I don't even know if I have enough grace left to say you're not a polytheist at that point.
Yeah. And it continues on and it gets worse. That's the problem. It doesn't stop there. Abstract thought, moral agency, self-awareness, relationality, and emotive expression. We may appropriately summarize these qualities as those that belong to a subject who is capable of love. Well, he may not be doing the old love argument, but he's wide open to push that argument. Indeed, persons are what they are by virtue of what they give each other. Wait a minute. So you have individual giving.
Love economy.
Yeah, man. I don't even understand how he can make the comments. Because we've had interactions before. Personally, I have on different media, and the interaction was very clearly, no, I'm not. But at that point in time, I had not read this book. I had his other book. I think it was dealing with Bernard's book, where this one's more broad spectrum on oneness. And after reading this, it's like, I was just like, wow. I don't understand where you can argue something else.
And I was trying to discern, is that because that's not the Boethian definition of person, even though the Boethian definition of person is still problematic. But I wonder, trying to look at the definition, maybe I overlooked the footnote he has there, but
yeah, the individual substance of a rational nature.
Oh yeah, no, that's Boethius. Yeah, which Boethius is. I'm sorry, like there a lot of Trinitarians today don't use Boethius because that's a problem. That's a whole problem.
Even Matt Slick in our discussion even recognized that it's a problem. When we had our 2-on-2 discussion open panel. And because what Trinitarians have to do is they have to make it a secondary substance, right? And it's basically, well, let's start trimming here, shifting here, and put another category here. And well, we got person in a headlock. We're good. It's like, man, that's not how definitions work. Trying to slide things in a secondary sense is just it's just not a very good way to do it. But they're Trinitarians. I guess they can make up how their doctrine works the way they want. So, but I have no problem with the term person, or even a Lokian sense of term person when it comes to the incarnation. One who understands himself across time by experience and relation. I believe the incarnation does cover that. That's how you have true human consciousness, rationale, and will to make decisions. If you don't have that, I don't know what the purpose of the incarnation is. But I don't believe in independence. That's God's intent to exist as man for the purpose of redemption. And God is bringing forth the true Messiah, which is the true kinsman redeemer. So in that sense, is there a person? Yes, in the sense of most of the qualities that we perceive as a person, yes. But it's not an independent existence. The underlying reality or ultimate grounding of the incarnation is God's expression to exist as true man. True man must mean true man in every way. If there's not, then what do we have to redeem us? And that's where I would agree with Gregory of Nazianzus against Apollinaris. The most important part is the mind. And if we don't have that which redeems us and by our mind, then there's basically no redemption. If we are partially redeemed, what does it mean? So God had to take upon and express himself, and that true man is true son of God, true son of man. Oh. Anybody else want to go on further with the term person or anything like that, or read down through here? Or?
I think you hit it pretty good.
We can move on. Yeah, I think we can move on. Me personally, I don't know if y'all saw major issues with the word being when he defined that. I
Yes.
really didn't see anything like you saw major issues.
No. If the way
Seemed
he used
generic.
being, yes, it didn't correlate well to me with person. It's very generic. It didn't help, if that makes sense.
Just talking
Um,
about existence, what way something exists, and you know that doesn't really, like you said, doesn't really help with the definitions of how. I mean, if anything, when you the citations using the I am the being, or talking about Exodus 3:14. Uh, Here's my thing with pronouns, the whole pronoun argument, right? Here's where I think a lot of translators try to play both sides. When you have singular pronouns, they don't want to say that means more. That only means one person. That can mean something more to them. That doesn't determine how many persons are within the Godhead or within the existence of what God is or who God is, right? Um, but when you see any time of like, you know, second person pronouns like we, right? Um, and like Genesis 1:26, for instance, um, all of a sudden that has such weight to it that it must be a plurality of persons. So to me, it's like, does the pronouns make a substantial claim of how many persons are within the Godhead, or does it not? So if you see the I, right, with no specification of Father, Son, Spirit, you see the I just talking about referring to the one Yahweh. Is the I predicated to the being then, or like the whatness of God? But then how can the I be predicated to the whatness?
yeah, and that's a major problem.
You know what I'm
They
getting at
do
here
this all the
with
time.
Big problem.
Mm-hmm.
It
And when
goes
you talk
against
about being,
metaphysics.
oh, keep going.
Yeah, it goes against everything that they argue all the time.
Yeah, it's insane to me because when you talk about being, really what I'm hearing from a Trinitarian is you're trying to talk about the whatness of God, whereas when you talk about person, you're talking about the who-ness of God. But here, right now, you're speaking of some of the aspects of pronouns and whatnot in his definition. I mean, now, granted to him, right? He's trying to focus on the being part, just showing that God exists as a rational subject, right? But nonetheless, when you talk about persons, what makes a person is that they exist as a rational subject. You know, it. So is God, three, or one? And I know that you think I'm starting to play games with them, but that's generally where I don't think when he starts defining person and being that it really helped this case as much as he thought it did.
Yeah, I would say so, and especially on page 15, dealing with dealing with being defined. He quotes, of course, a beautiful passage from Exodus 3:14, the ego I me. What's that? Hold on there, and it, of course he says, which is translated, "I am the being." Well, it's my understanding, and of course, Brother Tim, if I'm wrong, please help me get right real fast. But isn't that an indication of being self-existent to say I am? Which, from my understanding, historically, with the doctrine of the Trinity, the historic view, now the social view, they all three of the persons, I say, which most of them would see the angel of the Lord that appeared, and I know this is going to be brought out even more later on in the series. Are you saying if this is the Son who's appeared here, are you saying he's Ase, which that means again, that's just opening up more of the. I wouldn't see how this is. I wouldn't see how this would be classical in any view. Even when the classical guys quote Exodus 3, I'm like, that will make the Son self-existent, which really wouldn't work for your model.
Right. And I will say that the section here on being alone, it doesn't have social Trinitarian construct, but in relations to his section on persons, that to me was the most telling section of his social Trinitarian construct. Is there anything else that y'all would like to add to that? Because it's such a small section. There's not really much. Like we said, it's generic. There's not really much to have commentary on.
No, I don't have anything on it.
I'm good.
Yeah. The only thing is, I know Unitarianism defined here where he goes into that. Um, I didn't really have too much
I
really to
have
say about it.
as much as many of my I have a great deal of friends, a great amount of friends who are Unitarian, who we talk and we disagree. Some from more of the I would consider the biblical Unitarian expression or the Hebrew roots different expression. So just prefacing this, I have great relations with different people who have different Christologies. But one of the things I've noticed Burgos does, and some others, even Delcor, they try to lump us together as if our Christologies are not distinct and deserve to be recognized within their contours. My suspicion, and of course, I want to make this clear, this is what I'm suspicious of, that it is easier to do this because from their viewpoint, they have more of a historical, and from their viewpoint, a boogeyman to hook us up to. Because when you say Unitarianism, even Unitarians have issues distinguishing themselves from among themselves. Like the biblical Unitarians always try to make it clear, no, I'm not a Unitarian Universalist. They're always getting into that. But when you do that, it causes people to not understand what we're saying. And I always say, well, yes, we can all say that we have a unipersonal view of God, but to say that we're Unitarian is almost to the same era of saying that because you have three persons, then you must be a tritheist. And I always made this clear. I'm not saying that I think we're better as persons than them or anything like that, but I think it doesn't bring the clarity that's needed because from their vantage point, they would deny the deity of Christ and they deserve to be represented fairly. And we would acknowledge the deity of Christ and we deserve to be represented fairly. It's always very strange to me when they do this, and you've spent all this time calling us modalistic monarchians and Sabellians, and what's the need to pin us with Unitarianism since you have such a plethora of already existing prejudicial words to use at your whim?
Yeah, no, I hear you. I think I will say, although I do agree, like this lumping us in with the same as Unitarians, it does take away some vital distinctions between us, and I don't think biblical Unitarians would want to necessarily be lumped in fully with us either. Although, um, I will say the way that he tried to define Unitarianism, I guess we would fit in his categories. So if he wants to put, because all he was saying is that Unitarian just means that you believe in a unipersonal God. If that's all he wants to define Unitarians, then what he's basically saying, and I think he said this very clearly, is that Unitarians basically are just rejection of the Trinity, which I don't think, I really don't think that's the basis of Unitarianism because there's like there's a like Mario. Remember, Mario is a binitarian. I wouldn't consider him
Biblical
any form
Binitarian.
of a Unitarian. Biblical Binitarian. So I wouldn't consider him any form of Unitarian. So it must be you have to exclude him from that, So he must just be referring to modalist and biblical Unitarians. In terms of his other stuff as he continues the monotheism defined, right, and he gets into this more, so we don't really need to cover this section too much, I don't think, only because he spends the next chapter 2 entirely on it. But he just kind of he does kind of the typical or wait, no, sorry, this is modalism. I think he does he do, no, he doesn't. Okay, no, you passed monotheism, so you already had that in mind, Chris. Okay,
It's right above it, right here.
Yeah. Okay, I see. Because I was at the so like the only
That's
comment with
modalism, Patrick.
monotheism is that, and brother, we were talking about this earlier, and you have some sources, but I can pull up one right now. This whole thing of him kind of like mocking or scoffing at Bernard about the uses of strict monotheism. I think that's a little unfair because you'll have people like Bauckham who are one of the top Christologians, and he'll use and say that monotheism is indeed strict. So to say that it's kind of an oxymoron is not understanding the actual conversation at hand here. And what's ironic about this is that he wants to talk about the complexity issue, but when it's talking about here is the Lord of God, as the Lord is one, right? He wants to talk about how there's a compound unity that you could use with the word ahad, right? But that right there is already showing the difference between one who's considered monotheistic, and then one who has a stricter view of monotheism. Right there, it's already distinguishing between the two. And would he rather us be charitable to him and still try to put him in a monotheistic category, but just say that we have a stricter understanding of monotheism, or does he just want us to say like, well, we don't think that's a form of monotheism then? That's not monotheism. You know what I mean? I think he's being more charitable to them to try to make this distinction between their understanding of monotheism and our understanding of a stricter view of monotheism.
Yeah, and what's interesting, because I did pay attention to that. You're referring to page 17, where he takes, I believe that's page 17, where he takes special 16 through 17, where he takes special note to deal with what does Brother Bernard mean by strict monotheism. And I was a little disappointed with that, because that's very much a common expression within the conversation of which monotheism is a modern term, but when you especially deal in Second Temple period thought, that's a very common term. And there are different categories, as you have alluded to. Scholars such as Richard Bauckham, Jesus and the God of Israel, I believe he uses that term. Larry Hurtado, James D.G. Dunn, Daniel Boyarin, N.T. Wright, Mark Smith. I believe all of them either use the term directly or allude to a form of it. And to me, I'm not really sure if that's showing the best awareness of the scholastic material, because there are other phrases: exclusive monotheism, radical monotheism, uncompromising monotheism, because monotheism is a very modern term. In the ancient Near Eastern, the concepts of gods was a lot more fluid than what we have, where the automatic default presupposition is the Christian worldview. But just a quick search on Britannica under monotheism just reveals how already established this concept of distinctions within monotheistic thoughts that existed. That, guess what? It wasn't published by the United Pentecostal Church. It wasn't published by the WPF or PAW or QJC. Some of the phrases, alternative positions and articulations, pluriform monotheism. Now that was new for me. You have other aspects of it that are described, which to me, I just said, I'm not really sure if that's the best representation of this from an academic standpoint. I was a little bit disappointed, to be honest.
Right. And as you say, it's not oneness propaganda that we're proposing here. In fact, in contrast to these people who's talking about, like Bauckham, who holds it more, he would call it a stricter monotheism. You'll have people like Margaret Barker who say that monotheism isn't as strict. So it's not a conversation of whether it's an oxymoron or not. It's where are you at in the spectrum of monotheism. Chris, is there anything you want to add to that, or do you want to move on to the next?
No, I'm perfectly fine. I would agree. It just I just didn't see a lot of depth there. And I can understand maybe you want to get onto other things, but I did find one either affirms the existence of one creator God and denies the existence of any other gods, or they do not. See, that is so generic. What do you mean by that in like any metaphysical sense?
Either or fallacy.
Yeah,
because you got henotheism, monolatry, like that. Though that is just not even I meant to mention quasi monotheism. I'm like, it just doesn't reflect the reality of ancient Near Eastern thought, which it works apologetically, but it doesn't work scholastically.
I think that would be for those who just simply don't know any better. That's who to work for. It just wasn't very. I just thought it could have been a little bit. And I understand what he's trying to project, but the problem is it doesn't fit the real world.
Right. Which a good book. Oh, sorry, Timo.
No, you're good.
Oh, I was gonna say a really good book on this, and is Marvin Sangonetti's work. It's not him just trying to put up oneness propaganda. He's going through the different categories within the concept of Christian ideology, and one being the least strict view of monotheism, and the other one being the strictest view of monotheism. And going through that, it's a very well written book that I think is fairly trying to deal with the different groups in a honest way instead of just trying to set up an apologetics work for oneness ideology.
Yeah, I highly recommend Marvin Sanguinetti's work on that. If you have a chance, read his book. It's very, very well written, and I appreciate everything he does on his side on oneness. Modalism. I got to give Burgos some credit here in his notes. He does make clarifications that are so needed, and basically most Trinitarians get wrong all the time unless they've actually dealt with someone that has a decent understanding. He basically says, guess what? They're not sequential modalists. Where's the applause for Mr. Burgos? We're not sequential modalists. That would be a very good good statement. Yes. And let's face it, that's probably one of the most basic errors between that and flesh suit that we have to deal with. Everyone is on a spectrum in a theological sense. And what we mean by that is oneness has a baseline. All right. If you believe that Jesus is God, the most generic baseline for your view would be a flesh suit, a theophany type of existence that puts on flesh. That's like the most minimal baseline thing that you could have, right? And then you have a spectrum variation of what it means to be incarnated, right? So I guess, Nestorianism, right? So that would be our spectrum of what incarnation is. Trinitarians start from two baselines. Their first baseline, ultimately, naturally, to modern day people would be three persons is three persons. That's not the historical view, but that's how people naturally think. So they have a tendency on their baseline to go from three persons all the way to modalism. They also have the same spectrum as we do on the incarnation, right? So our baseline is Unitarianism on the view of God. I want you to think about this, folks. You take oneness view of God, not the incarnation, the oneness view of God, classical Trinitarianism, one mind, one will, one action, substance, essence, and nature. Father is the source of all thought, will, and action, right? Classical right here. You put Unitarianism over here as well. Guess what? Classical, oneness, and Unitarian have a closer view of God's existence as one than Burgos does. Because he believes in three minds and three wills. No one on this side believes that. They're way over here on one side of the paradigm. Literally, Unitarians, oneness, and classical Trinitarians, from a metaphysical point of view, are far closer.
Yeah, nobody's arguing that.
Yeah. I'm really interested to see if he does see his video, how he would respond to that. I could be wrong, but I could perceive them saying like, "Oh, I never said he had three minds," but it's like, but you said he had three rationales, practically.
Three wills. You have three wills. You have to have three minds. Yeah,
because the will is a reflection of the mind. Yeah,
and self-awareness. Each has self-awareness. I mean, how do you? I mean, there's no way of he left himself out of. Get out.
Yeah. And if he wants to start rejecting this view, I'd say for starters, take out his section and rework the person on his section on persons. And secondly, he needs to denounce Dalcour's book, just flat out. If he wants to start getting more into the classical mindset, he needs to denounce that as not actually a good source to biblical ideology.
And that's an interesting point. All the major works by Trinitarians against oneness, they're all social Trinitarian. Just a note.
There's a reason for that, I believe, and I was again talking to this friend. He's Coptic, and sometimes when he's heard me kind of engage with the finer points of Trinitarian theology, he cringes sometimes at the arguments some of them bring, and he was like, confessionally, I know they don't believe this, but they don't realize the arguments they're making. And I said, well, you have to realize on the Eastern and the Oriental side, you guys did not have a Protestant Reformation. You didn't have to deal with the negative aspect of rationalism. A lot of these things were experienced very much in the West. And a lot of these developments, I think, are very much in response to articulate against these very aggressive views against historic orthodoxy. And I said, you guys, I guess, kind of existed in your own silo. So when many of you, even your guys, go to looking for apologetic material to, I guess, articulate what you believe, the vast majority of apologetic Trinitarian material on the popular level is based from a Western, which arguably, if it's from the last 100 years, it's going to be a very social. Just as when you said that, I did kind of trigger my thought on that conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a good point.
Yep.
It's interesting. That was an interesting conversation to hear that, because like sometimes you do feel like there's a little bit of the gaslighting involved when you have people like I'll give you a good instance. On TikTok, there was a video coming out about like I don't know what the other guy was, but then there was it was one of our Trinitarian friends. And in the comments, another Trinitarian said, actually, oh yeah, it was the Unitarian, it was Gumbo. They're like, oh no, actually Gumbo's right in this situation. And another Trinitarian, Wisdom, she said, why are you trying to put down the brethren? It's like Wisdom is it's about honesty to the arguments. It's not just about your team winning. What's the point of proving the deity of Christ if you do it through lies? I'm sure
that's if you're trying to be honest.
Trying to say, but you know what I mean. Like, I don't know what else the implication is when you say stuff like that. And no hit towards her. I appreciate her. I just remember seeing that. I'm reflecting on that, especially with the conversation you just told me about. It's just interesting. But anyways, we can either move on unless y'all have something else to add.
No, I'm excited about that modalism conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I will, like right here, we were talking about,
yeah.
He does have it here. While some modalists may affirm a form of sequential modalism, such a view is not commonly held by Oneness Pentecostals. However, Oneness adherents have tended to describe their theology in such a way that it can sound like sequential modalism. I'm going to be honest with you. I've been in Pentecost all my life. I've read virtually everything that you can get your hands on. I have never heard anyone argue sequential modalism.
Yeah.
Ever. I mean, that may be just my limitations. But
yeah. I think what he means by that is that because we kind of have this articulation, but it's like the Father in creation, the Son in redemption, the Holy Spirit, and what's the word for it?
Regeneration.
Regeneration. There you go. And the issue with that, though, you could say that rings of sequential modalism, but it's not, because we're not saying that he's switching hats, and it's only what the point is the primary function in which the simultaneous manifestations function in. So what we have the Father in creation, because in all aspects of creation we have the one true God the Father. And we have the Son in redemption, not because it's sequential where the Father just comes down, but in the act of redemption, that's when the incarnation starts, right?
Well, it's simultaneous. It's simultaneous modalism.
Right. And so that doesn't exclude a simultaneous modalistic format. And to say that rings of that, I'm not so sure. That really gets to the nuances of the actual argument of what makes one a sequential modalist and what makes one a simultaneous modalist. And it's not that phrase.
Right. I always say we're simultaneous modalists. One could argue maybe the revelation of the economy is sequential if you wanted to take it that far. But the
Sure.
nearest I have heard of people who would identify as oneness would be the S.C. Johnson branch of the movement, which is very niche. And I'll be honest, they're not much for conversation in some instances. They like fights, but they're not very into going into the depths of it. Uh, like the no son of God in heaven doctrine, like where the humanity is completely subsumed unto the deity. I would say that's probably the closest I could think of to some kind of sequential, but most of us, mainline oneness groups I know would make that a fellowship issue.
Yeah. In fact, we had a position paper on it in our documents for our articles of faith on the true humanity of Christ.
Yeah.
And I
Teclamarian,
know,
yeah.
and I know some have docked Bernard, and maybe the language was imprecise on his part about how the sonship has ended in a sense. But if you look, he's very careful not to say the sonship just ended. I probably wish that he probably didn't use that language. He definitely could have worded it better. I agree that it does kind of cause some what's the word for it? It kind of caused some misunderstandings.
Yeah.
And I wish, but in the end of the day, when you look at the fullness of what he's trying to say, he's not calling for a complete end of the sonship. That's why he says in a sense. So despite the lack of articulation there, I don't think he's actually calling for an end of the sonship fully.
Yeah, the more proper way to explain that is it's not about the ending of the sonship, it's the ending of the redemptive kingdom in time. When he delivers up the kingdom to the
Right.
Father, it doesn't mean he ceases to exist. It has to do with the kingdom as that age is coming to an end. And now you go to Revelations 21, all things are made new creation in that sense. And so therefore there's a new age. So in a sense, yes, the reign of a specific reign of the Son is coming to an end. And you shall reign until all enemies have been put under his feet. And obviously that's when the last enemy, which is death, is destroyed. So yes, there is in a sense a ending of something, but it's not the actual one we know is Jesus Christ. That's a little that definitely probably needed a little bit better clarification on Bernard's part. Because like I said, it did cause some confusion in many ways to different people.
And I think that's a good way to kind of go into this last section of this chapter. The question of non-biblical terminology. I have to admit, when we use these arguments of, oh, the word Trinity is not in the Bible, Burgos is right. It's almost disingenuous on our part if we kind of attack in that area. I think much more substantial of a claim that, and a better, more concrete way of really arguing for it is we don't think the concept is in Scripture. It's not about whether the term Trinity is in the Bible or not. It's not about whether certain ideas of perichoresis and certain terms that they use is in the Bible. Is the concept there? Now that's where the real argument begins, and we don't affirm that. I personally, when I see Scripture, when I'm seeing the some of the early church fathers and other creeds, I see a transition from a Hebraic mindset to a more trying to please a Greek philosophical background, trying to please the categories. So the categories are completely different, and that's why I lean pretty heavily. There's this book, can't remember the exact author off the top of my head, but it was a Trinitarian author because they viewed it as a good thing. But nonetheless, they know that there is a distinction in what happened, and you also see this with White and Dustin Smith's debate. Remember, because the Middle Platonic thought process and different Greek philosophical constructs, it was foreign to Scripture. It's utilized by the Church Fathers to have the precise language of Trinitarian ideology, and the same kind of happens with this author who's Trinitarian, and I think it's he or she, I can't remember. I think it was a he. He calls it wisdom in a Greek dress because what he's saying is they take the wisdom language that Paul used. They take the wisdom language that John uses, and they put Greek philosophical constructs behind it. So what the creeds are saying, it sounds like wisdom literature, but it's not. It's wisdom with a Greek dress. And so again, I totally get it. I get what Burgos is saying here, and he is right when it comes to this idea that it's wrong to say that someone who just because the term's not used, just because a certain term is not used in the Bible, is automatically wrong. But what I will push back and say, it's not the term that I have the problem with. It's the concept. I do not think the concept is biblical.
I think that's the heart of it. What do they call that? The exact word fallacy. And I know it's and I understand the utility of the question. Where in the Bible does it say Trinity? But to be fair, the Bible doesn't say oneness, per se. What I think the question would have to be, okay, is the absence of a word from the scripture, the absence, as you said, the concept. I definitely do think the absence of the word invites scrutiny to see is the concept there. But I think a lot of our people would do better to not weaponize that, because it doesn't take much to flip it right back on you and have egg on your face, as some would say.
Yeah, where does it say incarnation at? Where does rapture come from? Like it would go all day with different terms. Yeah.
just a little post tribbering. Sorry.
It does kind of remind me of kind of a past thought, and maybe I want to review some of the ways he exegetes certain passages. But if you go back to the beginning of his book, and he uses, because he uses the grammatical historical method just like we would, right? But what I'm noticing, and we'll get more into it in later videos, where does he really bring up true historical context? When does he ever actually bring up the historical part in the historical grammatical interpretation? I'm not trying to dog on only focusing on the grammar. Well, I am a little bit, but I'm not trying to say that it's bad to focus on grammar, but it's wrong to solely focus on that. And we'll get. It's just something that with this whole idea of the terminology, exact word fallacy, for some reason, it just brought to my mind how he utilizes that, but he never really focuses on these. Because while again, he's right, you can't just go based off the terminology. Whether the terminology is in there or not, we have to go based off the concept. And unfortunately, when he's trying to backfill this concept into the scriptures, he never actually focused on true historical exegesis of the text.
And you really hit something there, because to me, I would say really robust refutation of a position. I am a big advocate of the historical grammatical method, because what it does, it protects us from our own blind spots. It stops us from coming from conclusions like Abraham Lincoln had an iPhone or something. I mean, it just stops so much nonsense. And I think because that in an apologetic context, which many of his grammatical arguments did put me in mind of Del Core, they are hinged. They're very effective if taken outside of its historical context, which, according to Osborne in his book, The Hermeneutical Spiral, grammar tells you what was said, but it takes context to tell you what was meant. And I see none of that.
And you know what's funny? When he's doing his kind of his methodology section, he quotes the Hermeneutical Spiral. Burgos does.
That's wild.
But particularly focusing on progressive revelation. He doesn't utilize his own methods that he's drawing from.
I think peer review would stop a lot of that, but
Yeah, who's the publishing company? Church Militant Publications.
I believe that's the one he's on. I believe he owns that. Not knocking it, because I've self-published, but this is why I am such a strong advocate with Oneness Pentecostalism in our writing. And I think some of us want to become more comfortable with self-criticism or internal criticism, because I think if I can't withstand another person that believes what I believe to, like, wait a minute, Brandon, that's a dumb argument. I much rather someone else call me out for that than it go out and then it influences someone to use it, and then they end up having an unnecessary crisis of faith because of a simple oversight on my part.
Right. Right. No, I fully understand. I have people I love who and, I'm tempted to too, because you kind of get to control what you write more. But the downside of that is, one, I'm dyslexic, so there's gonna be some grammatical errors if I don't get someone to edit my books. But two, like you said, you're not peer reviewing it as much. It's a lot easier to get by with these thoughts, and maybe make statements about Tertullian. But anyways, we'll move on to the next chapter.
That was kind of rough. Thoughts on chapter 2 and Christological monotheism, especially when it comes to, the whole argument that he lays out. Obviously everyone points to the Shema. They have to fight against it. We fight for it. And they say, "Oh no, we're not fighting against it. We believe in it." But the question is, what does really one mean to these people? It doesn't really mean one, because ultimately, if you believe in some type of, I'll give you an example. One of the perfect examples that Trinitarians argue is it's substance, essence, and nature. That's one, right? So therefore, you have one God, and ultimately it's a corporate type deity to many of them. You have the LLC and you have the members, right? What the problem is that, yeah, God family, Al, love you, Al. But the thing is that if you take the basic principle of yin and yang, right? And let's say yin and yang, yin, yang, and yin. Yin and yang hate each other, but yin is the middle guy. It's the non-conflictor. But yin and yang despise each other. One is light, one is darkness. They are poles of opposites. Well, guess what? They don't have the same characteristics as each other, right? But they're still one entity. Is that polytheism? Ultimately, yes, it is. Well, while that may be a very, type of example, the reality is simply because you are one entity doesn't make it one God. That's the problem. Yin, yang, and yin prove you can be one essence, you can be one substance, right? And you can have the ultimate nature that both carry, like a social Trinitarian. But that doesn't make you one God. And because if any way you do that and you divide it up, unless you're a classical Trinitarian, you're going to have a lot of problems. And that's the reason why anybody knows me. Most people out there that claim to be classical are not classical. They have social Trinitarian tendencies all throughout their arguments. But there are some out there, and I have a lot less, very little issues with them, because ultimately, there's not a lot of real difference. Ultimately, when you, like my brother Nero was saying earlier, if you're just talking about some psychological model, and when you actually get down to it, you're just good luck trying to prove that's persons. That's not really persons. That's something else.
And as it relates to the chapter 2, especially going into the conversation of the Shema, and I think from his vantage point, it's absolutely essential for him to address this text, as it is a very pivotal text for our theology, which I would say any group that is professing monotheism, this should be on the list. And I think he makes a very fair point there on page 2. Biblical Judaism, both ancient and modern, employed the Shema as something of a creedal statement, and this by design. And in Deuteronomy 6:6-8, God commanded his people to give them a series of 4 imperatives, instructing them in how they are to encompass all aspects of their lives with the teaching of the Shema. And as you said, one of the major rebuttals is that, yes, we believe it's talking about one God, but it's not addressing the nature of God. And I sit and I process that in my mind a little bit. I said, okay, well, what if I follow this logic, which I could say perhaps that would be a good way to look at it, because if we're saying that this is articulating why there isn't an interdistinction of the nature of God, it would almost be conceding that their argument has validity. Because from our vantage point, nobody was arguing that. It's like nobody was arguing what's the fastest car. Well, they didn't exist. There wasn't an interdistinction in the why would they even be arguing that? But I look at it contextually, even starting with Deuteronomy 1:6, the God that appeared to us at Horeb, going back to Exodus 19, every possible way to identify God and to make him relationally known, which I would argue reflects more of an ancient Near Eastern metaphysical framework. He did it with the most unipersonal manifestations imaginable. You saw the God of Israel, you saw his feet. I talked to a man as a face to face. Nobody was asking, is it it was nowhere on their mind. It would have just been a nonsensical question.
Yeah. And Brother Nero, and to that point, because you bring up something that's, man, he's right. It's not talking about the nature of God, but that's a problem for them, because for their version of God being one is he's one because of his nature. There's one what? Three who's. Whereas we're showing Deuteronomy 6 is talking about God's relationship to his creation. There's only one God. There's only one genuine relationship overall between God and man. And I'm not trying to do that to cite, First Timothy, because that's talking about the mediatorship. But the point is that in the ancient Jewish context, they only knew him as a one he. So like this is not he's right. It's not talking about the nature of God. It's talking about the who-ness. It's talking about his relationship. Right. It's relational. And so I don't really get the distinction he's making here in this chapter. I thought it was kind of throwing mud at the wall, seeing what's stuck. I see this weird uptick of Trinitarians doing this. I saw White doing the debate with Justin Smith. And it's really confusing to me, because it's like, so what if he's contrasting him from the other gods? He's still using singular personal pronouns. And last time I checked, y'all think pronouns mean a lot. So just saying, like, it's just one of those things I'm a little bit less, I have a little bit less patience for, because it doesn't, I don't think it logically follows. I think it's very inconsistent.
Because it doesn't. And especially the book of Deuteronomy. And I haven't even looked at this off the top of my head in the Targums as of yet, but like Deuteronomy 32, I cares you like a man carries his child. He gives such strong paternal relation. And then that's when some say, well, no, he is the covenantal father in the way he's speaking. And I asked one friend, I said, what's the difference when the children of Israel were thinking of the covenantal father? Would they have been thinking of a different father when Jesus talked about his father in relation to his humanity? Would they have been thinking of someone else outside of that context? But even looking at this from the Septuagint, which the Septuagint, I do believe in, the great part was a very influential aspect of the New Testament writer's thought process, because, they try to play with echad as if it's not clear. But what you'll notice, according to BDAG, is using ias, and of course my Greeks even sound Southern, which is the number one, a single entity. Maybe you want to say that, and one person said, "Well, maybe you're looking into it because out of Egypt, I've called my son." You see there, and I had to say, well, I would have to agree. In some contexts, one could be talking about a group, but I said the issue is, you would be suggesting that I would automatically take this word out of its natural meaning and redefine it when there is not contextual precedence to understand it out of his natural reading. Obviously, when we're talking about Israel, is speaking of a one nation. And I say, okay, can you show me in the context where that just should tell me that this is not talking about one person? I can show you chapter after chapter surrounding it that would leave without question that in any way imaginable that this is not talking about a polypersonal entity. But I have to now assume this over 20-some thousand times in it's just nonsensical, you know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I that's true. And to further off on that, because kind of get back to the idea of one, when you're referring to the Greek, but in Burgos's usage of Ahad, he does go against trying to use that to prove supporting the Trinity too. He thinks that the common view is that it's talking about absolute oneness, but he's going to again declare that over God being the one being, the not necessarily being unipersonal of how that being exists. And I think at least he's trying to be consistent there, you know. And and also when you go back to like what you're talking about in the Greek text, I think you were referring to Mark, if I'm not mistaken. Ice or whatever, however you pronounce it, how that's more of a strict, one, um, that a lot of Unitarians like to bring that up. How he kind of understood that the implications of that, so he's not going to challenge it when it comes to Deuteronomy to try to make Ahad mean a compound unity and all that stuff. So I respect that he's trying to do stuff like that, but nonetheless, this weird detour to uh, trying to focus so much, hyperfixate on this idea that I was talking about other gods. So it's just the existence of God is one, but yet three who's. But at the same time, it's not talking about the nature of God. But then wait, isn't for you the only sense that God is one is by nature? So is it talking about the nature of God, is it not?
It is what's happening. He's introducing a metaphysical distinction that would not have been native to the ancient Near East. They would not have been thinking in these later Aristotelian Platonic categories. You are showing, as my wife says, your speech is betraying you. They would not have been thinking in these weird. Their metaphysical categories were based purely on relation. And I didn't mean to jump in there, but when you
no, you didn't jump in.
It triggers me.
Yeah, because you're just like
the problem
relation.
with the problem with the argument is actually very simple. Okay, because and this is what Trinitarians do. And I understand why they're finding every argument that they can. Forget about whether it has validity or not. We're running with it. The first argument they say, well, why didn't God use your kid? The loneness the lone, this, that, and the other. Well, wait a minute. If God did use that, which was only used 12 times in all of the New Testament, your first argument would be, well, why didn't God use the numerical one for this that's used the most often out of 952 to 970 times that Echad is used? Oh, wait a minute. Only, 28 times it's used with a plural as a potential plural compound unity to it? So, wait a minute. So less than right around 3% of the time, there's a potential plural there, a compound plural. You want me you just reverse the argument. You're just trying to find an argument. Echad is one. And even in the compound unity cases, it still means one because it has to have a relational value of one to have a compound value.
Yeah.
So 28 times in the Old Testament is it used, and you're somehow saying, well, we got the numbers.
Right.
Start playing the lottery, folks, because you might be fooled a little bit there on what numbers mean. Your kid is only used 12 times. 12 times. Now, the question is on Echad, isn't even, let's just grant, there's a possibility. 2.8% of the time. 2.8. You're going to be a winner one day. Just keep buying those tickets. So what do we find in the New Testament? Right? Okay. Wouldn't the revelation of the triune God, wouldn't that be found in the New Testament with Heis or Hen? Wouldn't that be? There it is, folks. No more debate. There is no debate. But what do we find? Oh, I don't know. We find the equivalent to Yechid used in the New Testament toward the Father. Oh, where would that be? I don't know. John  monos, alone, only. but no one ever brings that up as the response to this. Very rarely do you see that. When you go to the New Testament, where is him used? Oh, wait a minute. It's the incarnation. That's the difference. That's not ontological values of the divine. That's a composite what? Union of divine and human.
Right.
Well, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
But we don't
What
see
else would he say?
exactly. Well, that's what he's saying. So when we expect to see it, we do see it. But when we go to 1 Corinthians 8:6, and primarily to verse 4 and 5, the perfect setup, folks, for Paul to rewrite the books. What does he say? He talks about there's only one God in verse 4. Then he says, but there are many gods and many lords. And then he goes to verse 6 and says, but to us, there is one God, the Father.
Theos.
Where in the world would there ever be a better chance to clear up possible polytheism that, I don't know, the church has dealt with for 2,000 years, hearing about Trinitarian doctrine as a possible issue. And Paul just runs right past one God, many gods and many lords, and the potential, hey, wait a minute, guys, just to let you know, we do have 3 in 1. I don't want you to get confused here. Where's the qualifications? There's not any. Why? Because there's no need to qualify it. And when they say, well, 8:6, this is the Shema revisited. We have one God and one Lord. That's not what the Shema says. The one God and the one Lord is the Adonai, right? The one who's been made and given all power in heaven and earth. The one who is exalted, that at the name of Jesus, every knee shall bow and tongue shall confess that Jesus Christ is Lord to the glory of God the Father. Not the Trinity, not the eternal Son, the Holy Spirit, and glory and power be to the triune God and all that fun stuff. No. What do we see? We see the one God and the economic values of what the incarnation means. Because if someone is given all power in heaven and earth, what would that mean? Are you a Lord if you've been given all power in heaven and earth? Notice that's not intrinsic value. You can't give Yahwehness. You can't give eternal values. They are yours or they aren't yours. They're eternal. How, if you're given all power in heaven and earth, is this an economic authority by which you reign? Lord said in my Lord, sit on my right hand until I make thy foes thy footstool. Oh, man, that's a temporary reign. So is lordship also potentially temporary reign because it's economically needed? Because God has wisdom in creation. But Burgos wants to make 1 Corinthians 8:6, and I think there was a debate against White and Dustin Smith. Both said, I believe that White was like, well, this is, Deuteronomy 6:4 all over again. That's not how the text runs. I mean, I don't even know how he got there from that. Every text that says one God is obviously reiteration of Deuteronomy 6:4, but the one Lord, you're grabbing a lot.
And I think, and like for a clarification of our argument for anyone that's watching this video or will be watching it, it's not so much that we're saying that the Shema is not being cited here. It's more so the idea that it's being expanded. And if you want to say that it's even in some sense being expanded, it would be in terms of the human Messiah, as God, as is the fullness of God's presence and character manifested, and as this human Messiah. But this idea that you're trying to relate it to the Septuagint rendering of Kyrios as equivocating the name of God, the name of Yahweh. I don't know if you can. This seems like a word concept fallacy. I know Burgos, he cites Gordon Fee here, but more than, how to put this, except for the fact that Fee was kind of pumping his chest up and just saying that no one would deny this, it doesn't seem like he was actually making an argument to necessitate it as much as he's begging the question of some aspects of how the word "kurios" can also mean this. So, so for them to say one God, they're just trying to make room for Jesus. It just seems very, in some ways, ad hoc. It's, throwing it up to, trying to make a defense for their beliefs of how there can be one God yet and also one Lord. Whereas in the oneness position, the way we look at it now, we do have some people who kind of hold more to skin suit, and I would deny that. I think that that's not true to really our heartbeat of what it means to be oneness. But in our position, what we see is the one true God. He did express himself ultimately, but we always have to take account how he expressed himself. And this was in a true human ontology. This is a true man. This man has a will. This man has a relationship towards his God. And this man was designated as the one true Lord of the kingdom of Israel, of the kingdom of God. So
I would also even there's I think the gentleman's name is Krugler, if I'm not getting mistaken. But even dealing with the language of 1 Corinthians 8:6, he, like Rendell Harris, they posit a little bit of what they call like metaphysical prepositions that are being used to describe the divine, the for whom, through whom language, which I think it's, if I'm not having a moment, was that Romans 4:11 or so? I can't quite remember when they talk about the Father is for whom, through whom, by whom. If I'm not getting mixed up, and I can double check, but it used the same language of the Father that's used there. Then we see the same prepositions being applied to Christ in the same cosmic context, which is always very interesting. I have my course. Spoiler alert! I think this is a wisdom thing also, but it's I think none of that was touched upon, because this conversation of prepositional metaphysics is a big deal, which one could argue was a part of the conversation in Second Temple period Judaism.
yeah, and you're talking about were you talking about Romans, or I think it may be Ephesians 4, right?
It appears several places. Let me see.
Okay, because the one this is the interesting thing with Ephesians, because like I had this issue with I think it was Professor Mack when he's talking about, like, how there's one baptism, so he's trying to take away water baptism as an essential part of being in the social world of God's covenant community. But if you look at the context of Ephesians 4, and this kind of furthers the point with the one Lord and the one God also concept. I don't know if you want to put it on the screen, Chris, but let's see here. We'll start with verse 3. But seeing, being eager to keep the unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace, one body and one Spirit, just as also you were called with one hope of your calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who's over all and through all and in all. If you look at the concept here, what you'll have here is you have one Spirit. There's one Holy Spirit. But then talk about one baptism. That baptism, obviously talking about water baptism in this context. And usually what you'll see in the New Testament, when you have baptism without specifically talking about the baptism of fire, it's usually talking about water baptism. But what's interesting with all this, right, is 1-1-1-1. So it's showing you, it's not trying to conflate the Spirit with baptism, but it's showing you within the social context, right, of God's covenant community. We have one faith. We have one baptism, water baptism. We have the one Spirit, the eschatological Spirit that we are filled with, and that leads and guides us into all truth. We have one God, the Father, and we have one Lord, Jesus Christ, the human Messiah, the very God who has manifested his character fully in a human state as a genuine man, a human person, even, if you will. That's the one Lord. This is predicated only to the incarnation. And to try to use all these as ways to just secretly call Jesus one in essence with the Father in that sense, I don't know if it really fits with the context of Paul here. I really don't think it fits with the context of Paul in 1 Corinthians 8. So here, if you want to do comparative theology, we're looking at Paul's epistle in Ephesians, and we're looking at Paul's epistle to 1 Corinthians. it seems very clearly that this quote unquote expansion of the Shemal, if you even want to call it an expansion of the Shemal, may be referring to the enthronement of the Davidic kingship. It's the divine act of God, God's redemptive plan coming to fruition by finally placing the Messiah, the King of heaven, or the King of Israel per se, on the throne, the human Messiah. Is that, do you have any more that you want to add to that? Any of your own thoughts, maybe?
Trying to find, because I just had the paper on it, and it's going to drive me up the wall. And perhaps if I can give it later, put it, because I really would like the listeners to be aware of the fact, don't just take drive-by argumentations, especially when it comes to the grammar of the New Testament, because Paul is not writing in a silo. None of the writers are, and especially with these phrases, the through whom, for whom, all this, there's a reason it keeps reoccurring, and it's not an accident. And the article, one of them I have is by Ore McFarlane, Philo's Prepositional Metaphysics Within Early Christian Debates in the Relation of the Divine Nature of Agency. That's one, which that's dealing more with Philo, which you did a little bit of a different conversation, but some overlap. But there's another one by Andrei Romanov, Through One Lord Only, Theological Interpretation of the Meaning of Dia in 1 Corinthians 8:6. And there are some other ones, I guess, when my internal processor starts picking back up to remember where I put it.
Well, especially when you start getting into the arguments of what through Jesus Christ, right? When we look at Colossians 1, I love Colossians 1. That's probably one of my favorite chapters, especially proving the economy of oneness and the incarnation.
Yeah.
And when you get into, I think you're talking possibly about Romans 136 is for from him and through him and to him are all things. Of course, that's God is the ultimate source, right? And when you go through, sorry, that's Romans 11:36. When you go through these type of texts, right? When you look at the economic values, especially like here, Ephesians 4:4-6, these are very clearly economical. These are not ad interest statements about God. These are the realities of the one Lord, one faith, one baptism, right? It's one God and Father of all. The contrast, and this is what I find amazing. I literally found amazing in the White debate. Somehow, White thought it was a great idea to make a distinction between God and Yahweh, and I was just like, what in the world are you doing? Trying to make it, well, every time Lord is used, it's obviously Yahweh. No, that's just everything's a nail and you're a hammer. That's what you're doing. You're not this is probably one of the biggest failures of Trinitarian content. If oneness people want to know what will destroy the argument, it's very simple. Understand economy of the incarnation and post-exaltation of Jesus Christ. Paul is not trying to rewrite God. Paul is talking about the glorified Messiah and the kingship that is literal. That's the whole point of what it means when Paul's constantly saying, grace and peace be to you from God the Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. There's a true economic reality here known as the Son of God, Son of Man. This man, our kinsman redeemer, our Messiah, has saved us. This is, and the key is well, no one says that Jesus is the Father because that's an ontological error. The incarnation is the reality of the expression of God. You have to understand this as how things work economically. The aspect of Jesus is the reality of true man. That's God's intent to bring forth Redeemer that is true man. He's made like his brothers in every way. So what happens is this man has to bring about legal rights by being what? Submission, faith, all the things it takes to be justified. If you don't have that, you can't have exaltation. Otherwise, it's a scam, it's a sham, it was fake. If you don't have those things, faith is meaningless. Trust is meaningless. Submission is meaningless. So when we see the true exaltation of the man Jesus Christ, this is God's personal intent as a self-expression of himself as perfect man to be realized and exalted and glorified. This is a true man, that's Son of God, Son of Man. That doesn't negate that Jesus is God by source of his being, source of origin, God's intent and decree to express himself and bring forth true man as his own self-expression. We see this proper terminology. We see it as he is the image of the invisible God. He's the exact representation of his purpose, person, or hypostasis, right?
Right.
We see the terms that are needed to recognize the incarnation equals true man, true Son of God, God's own self-expression. I don't need to say Jesus is the Father. That's an ontological one-to-one correlation that's not true. God's intent isn't to be Superman or a theophany in flesh. No, this man has to have a relationship to God to be judged righteous to God. This man has to have these values to be proper man. He grows in wisdom, stature, learns good and to reject evil. He is the exact representation of God's wisdom, self-expression, and perfection as true man. It has all those qualities.
Right.
That's the argument. That's the Lord we give true glory and honor to. To whose glory? The Father's glory. Why is it only the Father's glory, folks? Because it's his purpose, it's his intent, it's his word expressed. That's why it's his glory.
Exactly. And that's why you can never separate Jesus from the incarnation. There isn't a divine hypostasis merely assuming a human, human nature, right? It is not as passive as that. It's not like, underneath the veil of having human nature, it's actually a divine being. Much more than one true God, like you said, expressed himself in and as this authentic man. And this is this is what I think true incarnation and how to understand the incarnation. And even if you want to use terms like hypostatic union, this is how you should really be understanding stuff like that, instead of trying to use this language of a divine hypostasis assuming humanity. Anything else to add, Brother Nero? Or
well, I didn't want to jump a bit, and it's especially as we're dealing with the Shema and going forward, some of the because I think some of the understanding, some of the background of this is going to be very important as we get into the latter part of this chapter, especially when we go to chapter 3. But I was looking at on page 27, of course, and I do appreciate it. On table 1, he does deal with Deuteronomy 6 and 4 from the Greek, and 1 Corinthians 8 and 6. Where he does show the grammatical similarities conceptually. My major criticism of this, though, it lacks the major scholarship around the conversation behind this. And I did find the article. The gentleman's name is Kugler, to be exact. And the work, just so we can have it, because that was going to bug me until I found it. It's a peer-reviewed article. It's called Judaism, Hellenism, and Early Christology, Prepositional Metaphysics and Middle Platonic Intermediary Doctrine. As I was alluding to earlier, all of this has a basis in an already existing conversation with like some of the wisdom literature writing to Jews who were being influenced by Greek thought. Some of the language that's used there is they do use a little bit of that to address some of these concepts, but it is not a wholesale adoption of all of the categories, but these are other ways to speak of the divine. And what's interesting, these two passages, which he does a good job of mentioning, but he doesn't really deal with the concept of the intermediary doctrine, which was being used there. And I'm gonna just read a small portion of this. I don't want to quote too much, but what's interesting, all of these phrases like tapanta, all of these phrases, they were already being used in the time period before we get there. But nobody else was taking this to mean, okay, must mean another distinct divine person. I believe he was using the tools in the New Testament authors, especially when you get to, Dia Atu through him, 1:3, even monogenes theos, 1:18, John 1:3, all of that grammatically scholars are saying deals with the intermediary doctrine, which wasn't dealing with another divine person, but dealing with the immanent God as opposed to the exalted God, so to speak, which weren't two gods. I think Philo may call them durotheos, but I don't really think that's what Philo was trying to say, because Philo was speaking through a Stoic lens. But conceptually, I believe he was very monotheistic, strict monotheistic in a sense, but he was using the Greek categorical tools, some of them, not all of them, to communicate with the Alexandrian Jews and such. But that article by Kugler, I think it shows the embarrassment of context that's being left out of, I would say, the critique of the oneness position, because you're really not dealing with what the scholarship says. It's just more so I don't agree with what the oneness people are saying.
Yeah, and I think also when it comes to Philo, a lot of his viewpoint comes through an allegorical understanding. So at what sense can we really make these two powers or these aspects be like literally concrete, if you know what I mean? To be in the same sense that Trinitarians have kind of a concreteness between the persons, like the real distinctions and all that jazz. And I'm not saying I'm fully convinced or I die on that hill, but I do find it interesting that scholars like James Dunn doesn't really kind of have some of the views that some people have of Philo. He seems to, even have he has Philo holding on to a certain, I don't know if you want to call it monotheism, in a way that like is stricter than even what I originally perceive Philo to have had. And I think through the lens of his section on allegorical interpretation, if you read the rest of his work through that lens, you start realizing that these categories aren't as what's the word for it? Maybe literal, maybe concrete as one would have initially thought.
And especially because I know both of us are strong on wisdom. One of the things I think that's hard to ignore also is these phrases to ponta dia. All of them are smack dab in the middle of the sapiential genre. And that cannot be ignored. Kugler makes another point. I promise I'm gonna stop quoting him, but he builds a little bit on Dunn and I think Bauckham that these prepositional metaphysics, as he would call them, are building upon the cosmological context of creation, which these are the highest identifications of deity possible, from the arguments he's making. But like some of the texts, like I was looking at Dr. Burgos, he made the argument on page 28 dealing with Ech U Tapanta, from whom are all things, and the Son is the Dia Atu Panta. And I'm just finished reading. Since oneness theology posits Unitarianism, still making us Unitarians, and an incarnation, the identification of the Son as the one through whom all things were made must either be reconciled by means of an appeal to anachronism, or that all things were created through a Unitarian God who became the Son of Bethlehem. As funny as he's trying to be with the last solution, that's actually a little bit closer, even though I know that wasn't his intention. But the language that is using is actually more reflective of that. This is where Kugler he deals with the Middle Platonic intermediary doctrine, serves to distinguish between different levels of divinity. But he makes kind of the same argument. He cites the same phrases, that all of this is intermediary language to describe how God does things in creation, but still nowhere in the conversation. It was meant to because it's Middle Platonic, they have to have an intermediary to describe the actions of the divine. I know I've been kind of saying the same thing a little round and round again, but I was just kind of tickled because the main argument he's making, he was being facetious, but that was actually a little bit closer to the scholarship. Just being a little bit honest there.
Yeah.
Perspective, it is closer to the scholarship from that point of view. So what I find, I agree, because that's kind of amusing that he's arguing against something that actually scholarship would argue for if you're going to come from that point of view. And one of the other things I found very funny, and this is, and to be honest, it has more to do with because he has this selective amount of writings, right, that he's articulating from a oneness point of view, and he's brought them all together, and this is what it covers. Well, the problem is Mr. Burgos, you created an either or. There's another position, and that is new creation position, which I highly articulate, and which also includes wisdom Christology as well, because it's the reality of the Bible, through whom all things are, and Christ is the consummation of all wisdom of God realized in the man Jesus Christ. So there's one other position, which is a very economic position of the incarnation and exaltation, because when you go to Colossians 1, it's for him, right? And the others are also for him. Well, guess what, classical Trinitarians? You don't have for him for the knower and the known and the will, right? You don't give something to the known and the knower and the will. That's not how it works. You don't have economic values given to something that is the reason, but you do give it to the Messiah, the man, who is your true son, the unique one, the only begotten. Oh, wait a minute, Trinitarians, you like this phrase, the only begotten God? Okay, or the only unique God? Okay. It's all new creation in Christ. All things are through him. And when you go through the Pauline letters, guess what you see? You see the terminology of creation strictly seen about how we are related to all powers in heaven and earth, are given in him. All things cosmologically are given to him. There, matter of fact, are new reigns and authorities given because of the resurrected and exalted Christ. So when we go to Colossians 1, it's the kingdom of the Son, by whom we were redeemed, the image of the of God, right? The firstborn of every creature. I know y'all like to argue about preeminence over this, but how in the world is an eternal Son preeminent in that any sense? I can't wait to get into Colossians 1 and go through that with Mr. Burgos's writings on Colossians 1. Yeah, that is going to be so much fun. Yeah, that's going to be great. But the reality is no, he can be literally firstborn of all creation. Literally, he can be also preeminent because he's the firstborn from the dead. He's the first resurrected one. Therefore, he is preeminent in everything because he is the gateway by which all new creation is realized in him. How we have our being and are through him. So if all those things are true, guess what? This is only two options, and there's a very strong third option that has the power of wisdom Christology and economic incarnational values of exaltation in it. So you're going to get to see number 3, since you in your writings you missed this one, but that's probably not your fault. That's because of the literature you had. So that's okay.
I think also, if we want to kind of play off all these thoughts about this understanding he's having and the kind of mockery he is making of Bernard and Bernard's uses of done, he's not denying that he's not saying Bernard's using done wrongly. In fact, if you look at his footnote in footnote 83, he says that done. Let's see here. Most not recent. It said Dunn has read the incarnation back into the creative work of Christ as depicted in 1 Corinthians 8:6, and has subsequently erected a straw man. The issue that I see this with Burgos' comment there about Dunn is that he's assuming that Dunn's trying to do a work against Trinitarian ideology. Dunn's not talking about Trinitarian conception here. What he's saying is the most natural reading to him when he reads this text is that would be an issue. Because what he's showing is that the natural reading is obviously in reference to the incarnate Christ. This is in reference to the human, the man Jesus Christ. So when you're putting that, it's not really a straw man, because he's not automatically assuming your position to argue against. He's not saying, oh yeah, the most natural reading would be a Trinitarian reading. No, he's saying, no, the natural reading would be this. Not really trying to put it as Trinitarian reading, but it would be this. But this is why this would be issues if we do a strict literal wooden approach to this understanding. Instead, we need to put it deep within its historical context of what Paul's trying to get at. And is there anything else I want to add there? Because I know we're kind of getting towards the end of this video. We are going almost 2.5 hours, but
no, it is, and I think the reason, of course, he's so critical of Brother Bernard, because for some of these texts, he has been the only voice that sometimes has articulate them in writing. But I think, for one, this is a challenge where I think we will have to just provide more of the diversity of thought that exists out there. But it's kind of, because I remember in our debate when I cited Dunn and Hurtado, he called them liberal, and I'm like, really? I wasn't aware I was quoting liberal scholars there. But I think, and this is an issue with apologetics and the many apologists in general, the arguments are always devoid of historical context. And unfortunate, and I get it, when you're willing and dealing and you're trying to pull somebody out of what you consider error, sometimes you're just trying to give scriptural proofs, but none of, and I have a folder full of articles on this subject. None of these arguments really deal with the background. It's just literally taking, this is what it said, cutting out of its context, oneness is wrong. And it just kind of like, from our vantage point, if we're saying Trinitarians didn't exist, then we would have to say, okay, they weren't arguing against Trinitarians. From his vantage point, if you're saying they were Trinitarians, then they weren't arguing against oneness people. And even dealing with Colossians, I know we're going to hit on that a little bit later. One of the another scholar, he talked about one of the things that reason Paul really weaponized these cosmic creation motifs of Christ is because that was something that the people who were in the Colossian heresy had in common, was an adaptation of the wisdom literature, which to me, I'm like, there's so much meat, especially the fullness of the divine nature, and as like, this is such a deep conversation already in action, and it's just like, the only thing you're looking at this is like target the Trinity. It just misses the wealth of revelation Paul is trying to communicate.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting though to dismiss someone just as a liberal scholar. Though I think, wasn't I in the video that he did that? Like, I remember a few videos where he says stuff like that. It just, there's people that I think are considered more liberal, but I don't just discredit them because of that. I don't just sum it all up that, oh, they have this evil agenda. Some of the people generally came to their conclusions, and I think this is kind of getting away a little bit from the review, but one of the ways I've realized this the most, and I'm not saying I agree with a lot of what he says. I think sometimes his assumptions get the best of him, but Bart Ehrman, he wrote that book, how Jesus became God, right? And then the response from conservative Christians about how God became Jesus, it was just making a mockery of him. I don't.
They weren't interacting with his arguments.
I don't think this is the way we should act, and it actually made me. I like him more now because of that. I started just buying a bunch of Ehrman books, because what he showed me when I read his book is that even though he's a little bit arrogant in person, I have a harder time listening to his videos, but when he's writing, I don't sense such that there's a little bit more of an honest search going on. Even though he's come to different conclusions, he has the assumptions that he cannot believe in miracles. But nonetheless, I'll draw from where he has good arguments, and where he doesn't, then I'll disagree, and I'll tell you why I disagree. But to just chart people up to being liberal scholars, and I'm kind of surprised about Hurtado more than Dunn. I can kind of understand why someone would think Dunn is more liberal, but Hurtado kind of throws me. I put him in the same camp as Bauckham. Is Bauckham liberal too? His viewpoint.
Yeah, I was.
Just thoughts at that point. It's just lots of.
It was to me. I feel like it was a deflection to really push people away from the depths of the real conversation. Like I hate to say, the more I deal with apologists, the difference. And I'm not saying Dr. Burgos is just a mere apologist. I don't want to seem like I'm belittling him or anything like that. But in general, the more I deal with Trinitarian apologists, the more I'm just met with the reality that Trinitarian scholars and Trinitarian apologists are just two different things.
I'd agree with that.
Exactly. And I will say that even if he has done work, and it seems like there's some more, he has a little bit more rigor in his work, and I have to give him that, and I respect that. He still functions more as an apologist than a scholar, because typically you don't. Right. Typically, the first book that a scholar's going to write isn't going to be this. It's not going to be Heresy Hunter Central. But
yeah, that's it's the psychology of it all. I mean,
yeah, if that's his methodology, that's what he wants to do, then all power to him. It's just I'm just saying, like,
because
he's showing. Oh, keep going. Go ahead.
Oh no, I say it's obviously like against Oneness Pentecostalism is obviously a refocus on I guess trying to repackaging of Tertullian against Praxis. And I think that's why more I think about it, probably why he tried so hard to align us with historic modalism, which fun fact, modalism was not even a term until the late 1800s, until Adolf von Harnack coined it. They were just known as monarchians before then, which really applied to a lot of different groups. But I think for this to be as like, okay, I'm addressing the same thing. I hate to say, Tertullian, he's very snappy. He's very clapbackish, I guess, as we could say, but he would not represent the best of ancient thought, in my opinion. It's obvious he's a lawyer because he's very argumentative, but I wouldn't want a oneness Tertullian. I mean, just like to be an example of how to deal with Trinitarians. I wouldn't want that. That's, to me, I don't think that's the best way.
You wouldn't want that?
I wouldn't. To me, like on a serious level, it's not a good representation.
Well, he's kind of a butthole. He's kind of like nobody sometimes. You know what I mean? Like, bless his heart. Dom.
It's very entertaining. That not very.
Oh yeah.
Right. Entertainment and facts are they're not. Usually they're not in the same room.
Yeah.
Like the example Tertullian makes of the sun. The rays of the heat, and I say, well, you do know Hippolytus accused Sibelius of using the same example, which it was an Aristotelian example. But I just said, this is hilarious, man.
Well, considering he's a ditheist, so it's like, wait a minute, why would he call it a ditheist if he was a tritheist? That just tells you right there there are different mentalities of what each one taught. I mean, why not?
Speaking of. Oh, go ahead.
No, you're good.
No, I was saying, speaking of ditheism and liberal scholarship, I'm pretty sure he cites Margaret Barker in this book. I'm just curious about what his standards of why use liberal scholars at all then. If she ain't a liberal scholar, I don't know what is. She's likened to the type of Dan McClellan.
She is in her own zone.
Both. I like Dan McClellan. That's the thing. Like, I don't mind. I disagree with a lot of his stuff, but like, he's trying to be an academic, and I appreciate that. But I'm not the one over here just throwing people off the roof because they're they're liberal. I'm just,
Yeah, I mean,
I don't
arguments
know.
are argument. It doesn't matter what who it comes from, and I've always said this. I don't care
Yeah,
your background. I don't care whatever. An argument stands on its own. It's either has validity to it or it doesn't. What are you
right.
going to bring to the case? I don't want to hear you. Oh well, no. Where does it stand? Is there enough evidence on the spectrum of argumentation that says there's substance to this?
Right.
Because Trinitarian now, this is the thing about like Burgos and other Reform people. It's always all or nothing. There's no in the middle gray area potentiality to anyone's interpretation. It's always no. And that's the problem. If you can't see potentiality, you're just being dishonest.
Mm-hmm.
I look at an argument and I say, okay, what is the spectrum? Does this fit on the possibility of interpretation? And I go from there. I just don't negate an argument because I don't like you or I think you're wrong. That's not how interpretation works. That's not how hermeneutics work and good exegesis. That's not how it works. There's always potential there's a reason why there are so many views out there. It doesn't matter if their view fits the whole of Scripture, but for a limited context, there's potentiality there. That's why there's so many different views, because people focus on a small aspect and then make large doctrines from it. That's how it works. The question is does it fit the whole? Not is you have a micro argument here out of 3 scriptures and you go, oh, see, that I'm reading all of Scripture through that. That's great, but okay, I see the potential of what you're saying, but what does all of it say? Does this conflict? Is there problems? That's where you go from. That's proper. That's the proper way you do it. And when you got somebody like Burgos just kick it out, and other Reformed guys do the same thing, it's like, or Anthony or whoever else. No, it's just no.
Anthony Rob, yeah.
That's just not valid.
Yeah. Yeah, and just to keep it real, it's what, when you're subscribing to channels and trying to get good content out there, it's kind of the reason why we would subscribe to people like Jake the Muslim metaphysician, but then the backwoods preacher who made a YouTube channel who's oneness, just because I agree with the overall we're on the same team per se. If you have terrible arguments, I'm not going to be keeping track with you. I'm trying to make sure you don't embarrass me. I've been trying to
damage control
and
we have to do a lot of that
over here.
Yeah.
Which I'm surprised that instead of praising the book, that Burgos didn't do some damage control with that core. I'm gonna I'll die on that hill. Like, that's crazy work to me. Discount done. Discount. That's what I heard about the
But praise Delcor.
How do you do that? I don't even understand that. I mean, maybe you don't disagree with him, but to just discard him like that, man.
Liberal scholars. I'm like, then you'll be saying if we don't quote from one of them, you say we don't quote from scholarship. But then when we use scholarship as liberal scholars, we're like, you can't win for losing, man.
Have you ever noticed that
I'm not.
oneness are always stuck with doing what? Using Trinitarian resources, using X, Y, Z scholars that are all of theirs. But if you bring them up, oh, how dare you? They support your view. No, this is like, using Augustine on John 17:5. No, that doesn't mean I believe he didn't believe in eternal sonship. What I'm saying is he had an interpretation that we can agree with. And you know why? Because of the metaphysical aspects in the economy must be true for that to understand that Scripture. Trinitarians, you can't use John 17:5 as a pre-glory of an eternal person asking for it back or whatever version you want. It doesn't work in your view. Your classical.
You just gonna lose debates.
I know. I think he actually uses this verse, so we'll talk more about it. But what cracks me about it, Chris, is even with when Moses cites the verse, and they're like, "Oh, you're lying on our blessed Augustine, or you're lying on this church father," and we're like, either he doesn't believe what what you believe. We're like, yeah, it's like not dip, Sherlock. Like, you know what I mean? Like we know he believes in three co-equal, co-eternal persons. The point is that he doesn't try to use verse 5 in particular to always substantiate that claim.
He sees it as a problem.
Right. He's not using it for, even if it's economically revealing some form of three persons. It's not literally the Son asking for his glory back from the beginning as, a distinguishable conscious person.
Yeah.
Give it back to me. I put it in the jar right beside my throne. You're holding it for me. It's every time I hear Trent say, okay, great, I love this argument because I'm going to let you either two things are going to happen. You're going to show yourself to be a several subordinationist, polytheist, kenoticist, or you're going to have to just say what I'm saying, which just kind of
and it works. Hey, Trinitarians, I want to give you an amazing thought. You can actually agree with us on a lot of scriptural interpretations and still be a Trinitarian. Imagine that. Well, that's what Augustine did in his view, because it's an economic interpretation of how things exist. It doesn't deny other things. We're not saying he's oneness. That's not the point. The point is if your guys think this is a valid interpretation, you just can't dismiss it just because, well, I'm talking to a oneness. I'm going to be an apologist. I'm just going to reject it just to reject it, to make a scene. Yes. No. If your own people say X is possible, that gives us credence to say, guess what? Why is all these other things possible too? If it can be read that way as well.
Right.
We're trying to just play black and white all the time.
And just because they may not have meant it like how we would mean it, it does not mean that, like, it doesn't mean that what we're saying is wrong here. And the reason why I say that is because our point is that you trying to use this to completely disprove our viewpoint. It wasn't necessarily a bad interpretation. You can't be mocking us for something that church fathers who actually believe what y'all believe and don't believe what we believe is still getting props to the interpretation similar. It's just, it doesn't matter if their metaphysics is different than ours and their understanding of God's ontology is different than ours. What matters is that particular text and how to translate or interpret, per se, that particular text. And anyways, we were kind of going beyond the bounds of book review here. So, is there any other last comments you want to make? Huh?
I said it all intersects.
Oh, it does. You were right about that. Why it's so easy to go off road a little bit.
Well, you said there's anything as well. There's somebody here tonight. Got to do a some form of altar call all the time.
Where's the organ, brother?
Look, I got my Bluetooth already. Look, thank you, Oneness Jesus. There's somebody here tonight who hadn't obeyed Acts 2:38. We got people ready to baptize you.
Amen. With your hands.
All right. Well, I mean, I guess we'll end it here for tonight, and for this series, we'll pick it up again in the next series because I think we've went over 2.5 hours. So I think that's a good start.
An hour and a half did not work out.
Yeah, that's the way it works.
It was good.
Yeah, exactly.
It was a good video.
Yeah, and we'll add more things to this. Obviously, we're going to probably review the video and bring up some additional points, like everyone always likes to do post review. So, but hey, guys, we got to page 28 of 200 and some pages, and so it's going to be a good one. But we definitely appreciate y'all joining us and watching the video. Please like and subscribe. Also, this will probably be on Brother Nero's channel as well, and also follow Cloud's channel if they want to put it on there. So we want this just to be a series that everyone can reference and to engage in the discussion and learn more. I mean, that's the whole point of it all. Obviously, we're going to be critical of every side. We just want the best arguments and show how to hopefully come together on some agreements with different even Trinitarians. We agree with a lot of them on a lot of things, and even Unitarians. So Well, I just want to thank y'all, and God bless, and y'all have a great night.
Blessings.